The BS Report is a free-flowing conversation that occasionally touches on mature subjects.
First of all,
This is the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
it might be cool, I don't know. And if it's not, I don't care.
The BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Bill Simmons works for ESPN. He's also named the Sports Guy, and he writes a comical sports column. He must be a popular dude.
The BS Report.
It's got a real dirty sound, like a rusty steak knife cutting through a well-aged steak.
Now.
Here's Bill Simmons.
Welcome to the BS Report. You might remember 30 for 30, which ran on ESPN in 2009 and 2010, and we have kept the spirit going at ESPN Films. We have 7 new films that will premiere this fall under the ESPN Films 30 for 30 brand. And one of them, the first one that premieres September 29th, September 27th, Tuesday, 8 o'clock, ESPN, was originally supposed to be a 30 for 30, and the guy in the Subway Fresh Take Hotline right now, Alex Gibney, such a perfectionist, he wanted more time. And our rule is always we want the filmmakers to be happy, take as much time as they can. He wanted to get it right. I think it's fantastic. Alex Gibney, what's happening?
Hey, Bill, how's it going?
So this was, how long did you spend on this? Over a year, right?
Oh, yeah, close to 2 years. I mean, I would not say every waking hour, but, we would put it aside and then wait for some more people and other stuff to come forward and then go back to it. And, I should say, too, the folks at ESPN were great and indeed encouraged me. I mean, it's pretty normal for a director to say, oh, it's got to be longer. But they actually encouraged me. My editor was horrified. He said, don't encourage him to make stuff longer. But I think in this case, the story really did warrant it. And we got so much new stuff about this Bartman incident, which is the subject of the film, that it really seemed to make it come alive.
And there's really 2 separate stories going on here. One is about Bartman, and there's a bigger story about just the concept of scapegoating with American sports. And for me, this one resonated because, I always felt Buckner just got a raw deal. And I've been saying that since it happened. He was not the reason the Red Sox lost the World Series. He was the iconic moment from the game that lost the Red Sox the World Series. But, man, if you watch that guy all year and how injured he was, and he came through a lot. Game 5 of the ALCS against the Angels, he had what I thought was the key at bat of the 9th inning when they came back. Got a single off Mike Witt, was yelling at him, trying to get him riled up, and was the heart and soul of that team. And the bottom line is he shouldn't have been out there. They took him out every time as a defensive replacement. They put Dave Stapleton in, and in that specific game, the manager got sentimental and was like, no, I want him out there when we win the World Series. But anyway, by the time he made that error, the game, they weren't going to win that game anyway. And
it was already tied.
You were very sympathetic to Buckner, which I appreciated. What led you down that path in a Bartman documentary?
Well, the assignment was Bartman. I mean, we were trying to find a subject, and ESPN suggested Bartman, and I thought about it, but I kind of came at it through the emotion, through the pain. And this idea of, I had experienced a similar thing that the Chicago Cubs fan has experienced with Bartman, which was getting so close to victory and then having the hopes dashed, and recalling just how painful it was. So it started out sort of examining that pain, but as I got further into it, it was also examining why was it that I and so many fans in Boston and then also in Chicago with Bartman, why did we need to seek out one person to blame it all on? It became so iconic, and both these instances were Game 6, not even Game 7.
Right.
But somehow there was a desperate need to hang it on somebody, and that also began to interest me a great deal, and I realized, that I had dealt with that in some of my other non-sports films, so I dug in deeper on that than I had initially intended, and I think it yielded a lot of interesting stuff.
I mean, seriously, you could have gone 6 documentaries, 6 hours, and done just the history of scapegoats, because I think the first famous one was Fred Merkle.
Yeah, the Merkle boner.
Right. Yeah, which is funny that we called something the Merkle boner. That became the term for it. But That was the first famous one, and that kind of haunted that guy for the rest of his life. I think that was, 1908?
Right.
Something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
exactly.
baseball.
I think the 100th anniversary was yesterday, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, wow. Oh, so then it was 1911 then. Yeah, it was 1911. I can't find it. Anyway, yeah, and it's just baseball, for whatever reason, has always been the sport that lends itself the most to the scapegoat.
Donnie Moore, that was a horrible thing. I mean, that ended badly,
Yep.
and I think Donnie, had other issues besides that.
Yes.
But there was something where he felt so haunted, that he was the one. This is, of course, the ALCS series that leads up to the '86 World Series.
Right.
But yeah, there are. It's really an intriguing thing when you have one person who seems to be the focus for everyone's disappointment, and it's how the enthusiasm of the fan turns around in that disappointment to a very dark place.
I think Ralph Franco was another famous one. You pointed out that there's really no rhyme or reason to this because, easily Alex Gonzalez could have also been the GOAT that people pointed to for the rest of his life about how that Bartman inning played out. But because, it was a combination of things. I think it was Moises Alou's reaction, which you went into.
Yep.
Just the timing of it, I think, and as a Red Sox fan, I totally identify with this because before 2004, this is the way we thought. You're always looking for these omens that kind of prove to you that this was going to turn and go to a bad place. And anytime you saw an omen, you're like, oh, God, here we go. Oh, this is it. We're going to get screwed. And the Bartman, just that play, you could just feel it in the crowd. And I've been in Fenway when you could feel it. You could feel the energy just turn against the game. So, and I remember watching the Bartman thing when it happened thinking, oh, my God, they're going to lose. And for whatever reason, he's the only one who gets mentioned now. And there was a lot of stuff that went into that inning, as you explained in the documentary, right?
A lot of stuff. I mean, not only was there Alex Gonzalez booting a surefire double play ball, but, there was the fact that Mark Pryor at that point in the season was tired, and they didn't have much of a bullpen. So, Pryor gets tired. They let him, they relieve him, but then the Marlins just exploded on the Cubs bullpen. And then, of course, there was the next day. But I think they were so haunted by the expectation of the town. And as you say, as in Boston, at least before 2004, there was that sense of doom, the idea that it was just always right around the corner. It was almost like, what's the famous myth of Sisyphus? The guy who rolls the boulder up the hill only to get to the very crest of the hill, and then it always rolls back down again.
Right.
Well, I guess that's what they were facing, and they're looking for some way to make sense of all that disappointment that never seems to end.
And I remember, I think it was 2000. I'm going to say it was 2000, September. The Red Sox were fighting to get into the playoffs. There's a wild card. It was a 1-0 game. It was Pedro against Bartolo Colon, I think. And it was a day game. It was great. Atmosphere was great. And we were down a run, and Nomar hit a ball that hit the very top of the wall but wasn't a homer. It was as far up the wall as you could have hit a ball and not have it gone out. And
I remember that
double. It ended up being a double, and everyone in the park knew we were going to lose, and you could feel it. You could just feel it in the ballpark. This is it. That was our chance. We were done. And I refused to believe. I've asked Red Sox players about this. I asked Kevin Millar about this a couple months ago when he came on the podcast. Do you feel that as a player? And he was like, absolutely. You can absolutely feel it, and it absolutely affects you. And I guess the key, if you're, a jinxed franchise or a franchise with a perennial bad history, is to win a title, and that kind of energy goes away. But for the Cubs, you captured it. You found some of the most incredible video footage I've ever seen in a documentary of just what the crowd was actually like after that Bartman play. How did you find all that video footage?
Well, some of it was there. Some of it was in the Fox outtake. Some of it was supplied by a guy named Matt Liston, a filmmaker in his own right, who'd done a wonderful film about the Cubs and had been shooting a lot of stuff in the bleachers. And he had great footage, and in fact, fantastic footage over the wall of this sort of key moment, because Wrigley doesn't have a jumbotron, so he spotted this one guy who was holding a TV set on top of his head, and you know, hundreds of fans were gathered around looking at the Bartman play, you know, being replayed over and over and over again, and then out there on Waveland Avenue starts the chant of a-hole, a-hole, a-hole,
right,
which then spreads into the stands. Yeah. And then suddenly he's capturing that all around him. And then we found this other guy, a guy named Josh Doust, who was up in the upper deck and was or way up high behind Bartman, and he had his own camera that he had smuggled in and had a great angle which nobody had ever seen before. And he had just contacted us out of the blue. You know, we'd spread the word, if you have footage of this game, call us, and he did. And it was great, because also in and around his friends, you can really feel the hostility build to Bartman. I mean, that's one of the things that's amazing, is to see how in the friendly confines the hostility toward this kid really spreads, and spreads very, very fast until it reaches a kind of fever pitch.
Yeah. I thought it was incredible. And, you know, there's so much going on with that moment. You did a nice job of pointing out nobody blames the other guys around Bartman who went for that ball. It was like he went for it himself in a vacuum. And meanwhile, I've sat in seats like that at Fenway where you're in the first row. When there's a foul ball, you're just looking at the ball, and you're looking at it thinking, wow, that's going to come close to us. Uh-oh, that's coming at us. Oh, my God, that's right over me. That's really all you're thinking about. And there was 7, 8 people that went for that ball, it seemed like, and yet Bartman was the bad guy.
Correct. And in that footage that this kid Josh shot, you can see the guy who actually ended up with the ball. He had been kind of a mystery figure, but you saw a moment that you'd never seen before, which is, you know, after Bartman hits it, he doesn't catch it, and it spins away, and this guy holds it up. But he holds it up not like, oh, I'm ashamed of having, you know, grasped a ball that went off the hands of a guy who may have lost the Cubs their chance to go to the World Series. No, you see this guy holding it aloft, really happy, really proud, really excited, like, man, I got a ball.
Right.
None of that other stuff was going through his mind. It was just a simple idea. And we kind of start the film with that, too, the sort of magical notion of you're a fan among, 30 or 40,000 people in the stands, and the idea that a ball would find you out is such a magical idea, and it's one of the reasons, you know, you like going to the ballpark. And you're not going to give that up easily. And particularly, there was another aspect of the play in Chicago, too, which is where everyone, including Bartman, was sitting. You know, it's above a rather high wall, so it's not like that famous Jeter play in Yankee Stadium where he comes running toward the low seats down by third base. This is Moises Alou would have been hidden even from your kind of peripheral vision as you're looking up toward the ball. So it was pretty, it was pretty obvious that not only Bartman but all these other people were just going for it. The most famous of whom was a pub owner named Pat Looney, who admitted it. I mean, if the wind had not been blowing out a little bit, he would have touched the ball. He would have been the one. He was clearly going for it.
And also, that's a hard catch. Even if Bartman doesn't touch the ball, I'm not positive Alou makes the catch. I just watched a Red Sox game this week. I forget who it was, but it was the left fielder on either Baltimore. I think it was left fielder on Baltimore. And it was basically the exact same play as the Alou play. And the guy he was feeling out for the wall, and it fell right between him and the wall. It was a foul ball, which is really hard to do at Fenway, to have a foul ball and have the guy there not catch it, not hit the wall. It's not an easy play. I don't know for sure if he would have caught it. And as you pointed out in the documentary, Alou's reaction after what happened was kind of the gasoline on the fire moment, right?
There's no doubt about that. I actually think that Alou might have caught that ball. He was not a great fielder, but as he himself says, and you can see it in the footage, he did jump right, and you can see that the ball was right above his glove. So we'll never know whether he would have closed his glove, whether he would have dropped down, or the ball would have dropped out, or what. But he was right there. There's no doubt it would have hit his glove and the pocket of his glove. But and maybe that's the reason that for a change he did everything right. And this time, a fan reaches out and touches the ball. He went nuts. And not only does he go nuts, but he looks back at Bartman, or in the direction of Bartman, a number of times, and it really focuses everyone's attention on that place and that fan. And then soon, I think Bartman also helps to some extent. I mean, it's not like I'm blaming him, but he was not a flamboyant character. He was a meek guy who just kind of sat there like a deer in the headlights with the headphones over his head and didn't seem to be surrounded by friends, even though we now know he was. And that, I think, increased the ire of the fans. It was like that guy who's looking guilty because he's just sitting there. And also, I think the ugly thing about scapegoating is that, when you look to scapegoat somebody, you usually don't go after somebody who can punch back. You usually go after somebody who's going to take it, or who's meek, or bullies tend to go after weaklings. And I think it's a sad fact that it's part of the uglier side of our nature that is what we do, and Bartman certainly seemed to fit that role.
And also, he didn't help his cause by just the way he looked. He was so identifiable with the Cubs hat, with the giant headphones over the Cubs hat. Like, he could have pretty easily blended into that crowd if he was just dressed like everybody else. But there's something about him that it almost looked like Trey Parker and Matt Stone drew him or something. They just stuck.
There's no doubt about that, and the fact that he just kept staring straight ahead, sort of expressionless, as if he was kind of a wounded deer. It really, I think in some way it brought it on. I'm not saying it was right. Yeah. I'm just saying I think it did contribute to it.
Well, he was horrified because he was a massive Cubs fan, and I think if you're a real, genuine sports fan, you realize immediately, oh my God, this is going to now follow me.
Right, and I think there was a long time where he didn't quite know what was going on. Like, he turned, we show the moment in the film, and we have the woman who was sitting behind him, talking about it. He turns to her and said, did I do anything wrong? And she, of course, shakes her head, says, no, it's all fine. But I think he did internalize the moment, and he was maybe, I think the interesting thing about the film, of course, is that Bartman never appears to speak for himself. We try very hard, but he doesn't. But the idea that some dread and uncertainty was building in him that he couldn't really express, and it got worse and worse and worse.
And I've seen multiple cuts of your film, and at one point you didn't have you didn't make the connection of he's listening to this game on the radio. There's a delay in the radio telecast, and was there some sort of moment between the radio telecast and what we saw with the actual footage as he's listening on the delay, where it really dawns, where the announcer's killing him, and it really dawns on him, oh my God, I have become the scapegoat. And
it's me. I'm the one.
Yeah, that's tough. And, Cubs fans, when we announced that we were doing this documentary, and I get it from Cubs fans because I used to hate when Fox did this, and they used to beat the curse of the Bambino into the ground with the Red Sox, and it became this narrative that, you knew it was coming at any point in time in any big Red Sox game. You knew the Babe Ruth picture was coming. You knew the montage of Tony Perez and the 67 World Series and Enos Slaughter and Billy Buckner. You knew it was coming. So the Cubs fans, rightfully, I think, had their guard up about this documentary. But I really think it's a documentary that, I don't think will make them mad. I actually think it'll make them think about this whole thing differently. And you come away from it feeling terrible for Steve Bartman. I mean, even worse than what happened to Buckner. I think this is a guy who, even that night, was in real physical danger. And you found some pretty good video footage of him, like where it really seems like they're gonna attack him.
Yes, there's no doubt about it. I mean, that's one of the things that got me interested in doing the film in the first place. When I saw that footage of him being led down the runway into that back area underneath Wrigley Field. You know, people are pelting him. They're furious. They're shouting at him. You can see the faces of the people as he's passing them, and they are trying to rip him to shreds. And I thought, wow. I mean, he's a fan. He touched a foul ball. You know, it was shocking footage. And even from some of the footage, the audio of some of the footage from that kid Josh Dowse, you also hear some really shocking comments directed at Bartman, like, you know, put a 12 gauge in your mouth and pull the trigger. You know, it's really hostile, and you're thinking, wow, where does that come from?
I don't know, and you know, I think the one thing we can all agree on is Bartman handled it with as much dignity as anybody could have handled it. I mean, he's fallen off the face of the earth. There's been all kinds of rumors about, you know, I remember hearing at one point he'd moved to London, he'd changed his name, so on and so on, and it's almost become like an urban legend. What happened to this guy? When you try to contact him, what'd you find?
A brick wall. I mean, I went through his attorney. We tried to go through members of his family. They steered us to an attorney, and we tried to contact him. I wrote him letters, and he did pass the letters on to Steve, but Steve just wasn't interested in participating, and that's been a pretty consistent position of his. I mean, he'd been offered, in fact, quite a bit of money. In fact, to appear in a Super Bowl commercial, which would have netted him a lot, not to mention card shows and so forth and so on. He could have really profited from this. And it is interesting in a society which is so publicity-oriented. You know, we're all looking for that 15 minutes. Steve Bartman didn't want any of that. And he's become, as you say, a kind of urban legend, a sort of haunted figure who just really won't engage the public at all. He wants to be left alone. We approached his coworkers to see if they would, you know, chat with him on our behalf, and they said, no, we're just not interested in doing that. Steve's made it clear to us that he doesn't want that, so we're not going to go there. We did include, and of course it made me feel awkward too, because, you know, a lot of the time I'm thinking, well, gosh, you know, what am I doing here? Am I just, you know, contributing to the torment of an individual? And I did include in the film the story of a ESPN.com reporter, a guy named Wayne Drays, who was given the assignment of finding Bartman, no matter what it took. Find him, you know, stalk him, and then confront him, and so we can see where he is and what he's doing. And, you know, we describe that, and Wayne's in the film, and he talks about it, and he does meet Bartman. But it's a very weird and unsatisfying moment because he's being pressured to find out something about this guy by his editor, but he's very ambivalent about it. Like, why should we disturb his privacy? And that's why ultimately I became quite comfortable with the idea that Bartman would never be in the film. I didn't need to stalk him. He didn't want to be in it. But the idea that he's not in it becomes a very sort of key and important part of the story. It's who he wants to be. And it's like that great, you know, in the Odyssey, what's that, the Cyclops, the big giant, turns to Odysseus and said, who has blinded me? And Odysseus says, no man. And that's like, Bartman is no man. He's living his own private life, but he doesn't want, as far as the public is concerned, he is no man.
And I would argue that he's the biggest Cubs fan out there because he knows what that would mean to the other Cubs fans if they saw him at some autograph show or they saw him on Barbara Walters, the first exclusive Steve Bartman interview, or some magazine exclusive. He's walked away from that money. And by the way, almost all of these guys end up going for the money. Like Ralph Branca and Billy Thompson signed baseballs together for years and years. So did Bill Buckner and Mookie Wilson. Like,
absolutely.
Eventually, these guys reach a point where they're like, screw it. You know, it was a million years ago. It's just sports. I'm 50 years old. I can make some money for my family. I don't care anymore. Bartman has been steadfast. Wants nothing to do with this ever again, which I think is, I don't know. I feel bad for him, and I really hope he watches your documentary. Did you send him a copy, or you just expect that he'll watch this week if he watches it at all?
We sent him a copy of the finished film, and I expect he'll be watching, but I don't know. Maybe not.
Yeah. To me, I've been asked a couple times, like people saying, like, what would be the number one person you'd ever want to interview for a feature? And for me, it's Bartman, because I don't know what that guy. I'm so fascinated to know what that guy's life has been for the last 8 years, and I'm sure he just lives with this pit in his stomach. And when you watch that video footage of that night, I'm sure he was really scarred by that night and doesn't ever want to be in a situation where people are coming at him like that again. Do you think that's why he's kept such a low profile?
I'm only guessing, but I would have to think that that's part of it. That he really did feel his life was in danger, and I don't think he'd ever really experienced something like that, and that must still haunt him. It's got to be one of the reasons, and that's why. I mean, not only would I like to I'm with you. I would love to talk to him, and I would like to find out not only what he's been doing all this time, but I would like him to give us the blow by blow of that night, because I bet it's vividly etched in his mind. And it's the one thing that we don't know. I mean, we know so much about it now, having spent so much time finding all these different people, including the security guard who actually took him into her house. Into her apartment, to keep him from a mob. Oh, somebody was saying it was like Frankenstein, people storming the gates of Frankenstein's castle. She took him into her house, so we know a lot about him for those moments, but we don't know what was going through his head and how he experienced that. And I would be dying to know about that. Maybe someday we will.
And like Bill Buckner, a big part of that story, which people just forget, is that he eventually came back. He came back to the Red Sox in 1990, and it was pretty emotional. It's not like we had won the World Series where the fans were ready to forgive him. Like, he came back, and it was a big deal, and a big deal was made about how a lot of people were responsible for that game. We shouldn't scapegoat this guy. He got a standing O when he'd hit. Like, people did forgive him to some degree in 1990. I thought it was interesting when he appeared in that Transcendent Curb Your Enthusiasm episode, and he got quote-unquote redeemed in the episode. I got a lot of emails from people like, do you feel like Billy Buckner's finally been redeemed in Boston? And, my counter to that is I think people let that one go a long time ago, and especially after 2004. I think once you win a title, you don't really scapegoat people like that. You just, whatever grudge you might have had, you lose. With the Cubs, if they win the title, it would be pretty weird to still hold a grudge against Bartman, right?
I think it would be impossible. I think it would all disappear. But I think, it's a funny thing. The other thing that happens is that when you win the title, of course, it all doesn't mean that much anymore. I think that, after 2004 and after 2007, it was just a lot easier for me. But I didn't feel the pain, but I didn't feel the expectation as much either. It's like, so it became more pleasant, but not nearly as intense. So I must say, I did struggle through 13 innings last night.
Right.
As I'm watching this Titanic collapse, but it still didn't quite have the edge or intensity prior to 2004.
We're taping this on a Monday for Tuesday, by the way. So he's referring to Sunday night's 13-inning game, and I'm with you. I mean, if this September collapse had happened in 2002 or 2003, I think the city of Boston just shuts down. Like, I think I'm seeking psychiatric help. Because that's what one of the reasons I wanted to take this on too was I remember post '86, it was so devastating for me, and I would walk around and think, well, why? I mean, why am I? Yeah. I really was in some kind of psychological torment, and I thought, well, it's a game. Can't you get over it? I really couldn't get over it. And I found that very interesting, and it's part of what I wanted to explore in Catching Hell. It's funny, the film is really about the fan. I mean, it's Buckner's in it, and Buckner I think is really helpful to the film in particular because you saw that Buckner had his own torment, which was would he ever forgive Boston? Not so much the fans, but the sports writers who he felt
he blamed for putting him through so much torment, and the media, for showing those replays over and over again. It took him a long time to let go, not until 2008 when he agrees to throw out the first ball.
Yeah.
But mostly it's about, and that was very important in the film because it allows everybody to get a sense of emotional relief. Like, you can get over this, you can get beyond it. So it was very important emotionally for the film. But I think that the film in its essence is really about the fan. It's about us.
You were working
and our passion, but also what happens when that passion turns in an ugly direction.
You were working at the same time as you were working on Catching Hell. At least I think it was somewhere in the same range. You were also working on Client 9, which was a documentary about Elliot Spitzer. Some similarities there to just the rug getting pulled out of you and your life turning a 180 and going into a terrible direction, right?
That's right. Of course, you'd have to say that in Elliot Spitzer's case,
Yep.
he certainly should have known what he was doing and what the consequences were. It wasn't like a momentary fly ball, but certainly once he was caught, it all turned around. And
became ugly.
It became very ugly, and it's also the other interesting parallel between Client 9 and Catching Hell is that there's a lot of the story you think you know that you don't really know. There's a lot of strange things that had to do with the way Spitzer was investigated, and also the powerful forces of the enemies that he was up against, and how they may have contributed to his demise. Though it must be always said that he was the guy who decided he was going to go, see escorts, not his enemies. But the way it played out, I think, surprised a lot of people who just thought it was kind of an open and shut story. It turns out when you dig into these things, they're a lot more complicated.
And that's really your goal when you start digging. You're hoping it gets a lot more complicated.
You're hoping.
I'm guessing.
You're hoping.
Yeah.
Because otherwise the film's going to be very short.
One thing that fascinates me about you, on anybody's top documentarian list, you're going to get mentioned, whether it's a top 5 or a top 10, whatever. You're always working on 2 or 3 at once, which some people can't do. Some people, they throw themselves into that one project, and that's what they do, and they have to finish it, and then they move on to the next thing. How are you able to concentrate on multiple things at once?
Well, it's hard. I mean, the fact is I'm probably ADD, and they tell you that if you're ADD, sometimes to compensate, you need to hyper-focus. So by loading my plate up too high, I probably do that to some extent. I think the other aspects are that, I remember a time when, the phone didn't ring so much, and I remember working on a single project and then being finished and then just sitting and waiting for the calls to pour in, and it was a long, lonely wait. And at that point, I was determined that I was not going to find myself in that position again. But there's also a pragmatic advantage to being able to do it if you can, and I seem to be able to be. And that is that sometimes when you're investigating something, the facts or the people you're trying to get to talk don't always conform to your timeline.
Right.
Sometimes it takes a while. Sometimes you have to wait for a legal proceeding to end. Sometimes you have to wait for certain footage to roll in. All sorts of things sometimes need to happen in order to get that extra piece that you really need to tell the story. If you're working on more than one, you can afford to wait. You can afford to just, okay, we're going to put this aside now. We know where it's at, and then we'll come back to it. And that has another peculiar advantage, too, because sometimes with a film, if you're racing to meet a deadline, and mind you, deadlines are very useful. They focus the mind. But if you're racing to meet a deadline, sometimes you don't see flaws in the film that you see if you step away for a couple of weeks and then come back to it, and you look at it and say, oh, my God, it's so obvious now what needs to happen. You get outside it, and then once you get outside the story, then you can come in and make the fix.
That's interesting. I actually thought that was going to be close to what your answer was, because I've noticed this when we get sent these different cuts sometimes, and the cuts will change, and most of the times they change for the better. There's a couple times where it seems like the guy or the girl was so lost into what they were doing that they kind of overthought it. But the common refrain you hear from the documentarians is, I needed to get away from it for a week, or I needed to get away from it for 2 weeks and work on something else. It's almost like you can become totally trapped into just that whole story and just trying to get there and trying to hone it down in the perfect time. Can you become too trapped? Can you reach a point where you're just like, I need to get away from this for like 6 months. I can't even think rationally about this anymore.
I think sometimes you do. I think, a lot of nonfiction writers talk about that, or even novelists too. Sometimes you just have to walk away and then come back. And then there's an advantage to doing that because you can then see it from the standpoint of the viewer or the reader, and you're just experiencing it. And then you can get back inside the story, knowing that you got to get back in the boiler room and like Scotty in Star Trek and see if you can, improve the thrusters.
Right.
But, the ability to see it from the outside and to see whether or not the story is working, that's really, really, really important.
How many people do you trust? Like, what do you have, like a little sounding board? Is there, because some people work differently on this. Some people don't trust anybody. Other people have like their little inner circle. They'll show the film to maybe 4 or 5 people and really trust their notes. Who is your circle? Whose opinion do you trust the most?
There's a small group of people I trust, but there's usually also, in addition to that, there is a series of screenings I like to have, and I invite usually a variety. People I trust very intimately, and people I don't either know at all or know so well. And then I like to see what kind of comments come in, and also sometimes I have ways of my editor, soliciting those comments when I'm not in the room, which is sometimes when you get the real honest story.
Yep.
And then what you do is you collate the comments and see what kind of consistency there is, whether everybody seems to spot the same thing. If that happens, then you know something's probably pretty wrong.
Yeah.
Sometimes, I disagree. I just disagree with people and get determined to go my own way. But usually, sometimes people spot things and will make suggestions on how to fix it, and you may disagree with how to fix it. But if you think a little bit harder about what they're going after, you realize, oh right, that's the problem they spotted. I don't agree with what they suggested, but maybe there's another way to do it.
Right. And I think that's when you get into that danger zone, because, and I think this is the biggest problem with television right now, with network television in Hollywood, is you have so many people giving the people notes, the people that do the show, that they just end up becoming this amalgam of everybody's notes, and there's no actual singular vision. I think that's what, I don't know if you watch Louis on FX, I think that's what made that show so special, because they literally left him alone. Right. And they said, we'll give you $300,000 or whatever it was, you come up with your show. And that's why the show felt so different, because he wasn't getting notes and he wasn't listening. And now, there's been a little revisionist history on this. He now claims that they are giving him notes. I think they're saving face a little bit. I think he does that show on his own. But, that's one of the things we try to do with 30 for 30 and all the documentaries going forward is you give notes, but you don't want to change the mindset the guy's in. I think if you even compromise that a little bit, it gets a little dangerous, right?
I totally agree, and I think I don't always give compliments to the producers or financiers, but ESPN has been really good about that, because I think they made a decision. You guys made a decision on the 30 for 30 and now the ESPN films that they would be director-driven films, that they would be authored films, and that idea is very important. And and I do that a lot when I work as a producer for other people. I realize it's their film, not my film, and I'm big enough to know that they'll do what they'll do. I offer suggestions and hope that helps them, find a better way to tell the story. But at the end of the day, it can't be filmed by committee, because if it's filmed by committee, then the film has no character. It has no personality.
Right.
And that's what's so great about this series is not only the stories that are being told, which are so cool, but every one is told in a wildly different way. Like the one that Brett Morgan did about that OJ day was just wildly inventive. Same thing with that. What was the Two Escobars?
The Two Escobars, yeah.
Fantastic film. And each one is done in a very different stylistic way. I like that a lot. But you're right. They have to be authored. And I think, authors, I think, sometimes can get too precious and only listen to themselves. And I think that's at their peril. But at the same time, it's the personality of the filmmaker that helps to make these stories interesting. That's what I always liked about the great nonfiction books, particularly in sports, like the great, some of the Halberstam books and others. You could feel the personality of the author in addition to getting a really, really great story, and that always meant something.
I wasn't fishing for a compliment there, I swear. It's just a theory about...
No, but I'm happy to give. I'm happy to give it because I really feel strong. Look, I was involved a number of years ago as a producer in a series called The Blues. It was executive produced by Martin Scorsese, and it was a bunch of documentaries on the blues, and it was done by different feature filmmakers: Clint Eastwood, Scorsese, Wim Wenders, Mike Figgis, Antoine Fuqua. Great filmmakers, and my job was just to help them do what they did. But it kind of changed my career. That was, it was only after I did that I was able to do Enron. And what was so great about that was that, Scorsese had given everybody the freedom to pursue that, series in a different way. That rather than make them all the same stylistically, that they would be all wildly different. And that was a real groundbreaker. And I think that's what, 30 for 30 did so successfully, and now ESPN films too. I think it's great.
Well, but that's not rocket science, right? If you're more empowered,
it shouldn't be. But
it's just if you're more empowered and you have a vision, and people are trying to unclutter that vision as much as they can, it just seems like that just should work for everything. That should work for scripted TV. That should work for movies. And yet, it seems like Hollywood has gone in this other direction, not with documentaries, but with movies and television, where they're compromising that vision more and more. And you just look at these fall TV shows, and you're like, Jesus, like, where are we going here? Creatively, where are we headed? That's the part, I think, for documentaries. That's why they've been able to thrive so much these last 6-7 years, because it's one of the last places where people have a real vision and they can execute it and be original about it. Do you agree or disagree?
Well, I don't think it's just documentaries. Look, I was a huge fan of The Wire. I thought that was wildly successful. So it's not like it doesn't happen in fiction. I just think maybe because the stakes are lower in documentary, and because, frankly, I think in the last 10 or 15 years, documentarians, I think, have thrown out the old rigid documentary rule book and allowed it to become a more personal medium, that it's become more interesting. So I think it can happen in fiction or nonfiction, but I do see it in docs a lot more frequently because maybe because the budgets aren't so high, the willingness to allow the experimentation is greater. But you really get that sense of vitality because you're seeing the work of an author who's trying to do their best.
And as you said, cable TV dramas have been where that's really shifted the last 10 years, and it's always like, it's the creator, basically. It's his vision, whether it's Ryan with The Shield, or Gilligan with Breaking Bad, or David Simon with The Wire, or
that's right.
And it's always one guy. And it's always amazing to me that TV doesn't just look at that and go, well, look, these are 9 shows that are all awesome, and they're mainly awesome because it was one guy and it was his vision. Maybe we need to start heading that way more, and they don't. With documentaries, when would you say this boom started? Because, there's just no question that the documentaries, I would say maybe starting with Enron right around there, 2004, 2005, they're so much better than they were in the 1990s. What explains that shift to where we are now?
I think it has to do a little bit with that brief period when suddenly theatrical documentaries were making a lot of money, and it meant that there was a freedom to try things outside of the cable paradigm, which at that time had become extremely rigid. There was an idea that, if you were channel flipping, before there were so many channels now that you can't possibly flip anymore. Before when you were channel flipping, you'd have to know instantly when you flipped to a channel that it was that channel. So everything would have to be branded with that channel style. And suddenly these feature docs were showing up in theaters, and people were going to them and saying, "Oh my God, this is wild! It's so different. It's so fresh." And sometimes also containing content, particularly sometimes political content that seemed so wildly different. So I think that's a lot of it. I think also the work of some people like Errol Morris, like when he did Thin Blue Line, and suddenly there was the idea that, oh my God, you could throw these imaginary sequences in there which spoke to different versions of the truth. That's interesting. Or now you have somebody like comes along and does a film like Waltz with Bashir, which is an animated documentary. You're thinking, which that year I thought was one of the best films of the year. So the degree of inventiveness is great, and I think it began at that moment in time where everything else, everywhere else, got so rigid that suddenly in theaters people got really jazzed by the idea that you could see fresh and innovative stories about really exciting subjects done by authors who were really turned on by telling them.
And then there's one more reason I'd throw in, a simple reason. The equipment's just better. You can basically go out there now with a really, really nice camera that doesn't cost a lot. And, I feel like that's changed the game a little bit,
I agree, because you can afford to experiment then. When you're going out there with a 16-millimeter camera or even one of those old Betacam decks, the technology was such a huge barrier, and it was also expensive that there was a reluctance to really roll the dice. Now you can go out, you can shoot something. If it doesn't work, screw it. I'll go out tomorrow. I'll try something else. It really is a tremendous advantage.
I have to ask this question. We 30 for 30 won something at the IDA Awards a few months ago. I can't remember when, but and we went, and the takeaway I got from that was the people that did documentaries, for the most part, they seemed kind of bitter, and it seemed like the recurring theme was like, we don't make a lot of money doing this. We spend a lot of years of our life, working and crafting these things, and it's really tough to make money, and we've got to keep this fight up. And then a couple times you were mentioned as like, we can't all be Alex Gibney making all this money. Like, can you sense that it's almost like if you do too well in documentaries, it's almost like there's a tiny bit of resentment? Do you sense that or no?
I think if you do too well anywhere, there's always going to be blowback.
Right.
And I remember that. I gather Morgan Spurlock, who's a pal, but was having some fun. At my expense. This is fine. And look, I feel lucky. I mean, how many people get to do, get to do what they like doing and get paid for it. But it's hard. I talk to my son about this a lot of times too, because if you really believe in what you do, sometimes you have to find ways of being practical and pragmatic while keeping what you want in your mind. I remember there's this great story about the famous American composer Charles Ives, who did exactly the music that he wanted to make, and it's difficult to listen to, to the avid fan. He's a huge figure, but Charles Ives was also a great insurance salesman. He was like insurance salesman of the year, and he just figured, look, I'll get my FU money that way. I'll sell insurance and then do what I want to do on the other end. And I'm not saying that documentarians shouldn't be paid well. They should if they can. But it pays to be pragmatic. A lot of people talk to me about like, how do you choose your subjects? And the fact is, there are a lot of times I don't choose them. Other people suggest them to me because they're willing to fund them, and then I decide whether or not there's enough in there for me to be interested. So I'm a little bit more pragmatic, and it's hard. But anyway,
also, I would argue there's a real talent toward picking subjects that, you're catching something almost before people realize that it should be a documentary, and then you're working on it as people are realizing it, and then you're releasing it when the iron is still hot, so to speak. I think Michael Lewis is somebody that has, in the nonfiction world has been just unbelievable at this. He's over
No
and over
doubt.
again been able to pick subjects ahead of where anybody even realized they were a book subject, and by the time they realize it, the book's out. And you've been able to do that. You did it with Enron. I think you did it with this Steve Bartman documentary, because I'd never really thought about the whole scapegoat thing before. You had Elliot Spitzer. There seems to be a certain wisdom to some of the subjects you're picking. It's not like you're spending 8 years like with some parking lot attendant in Pakistan.
Yeah, well, I've done that too.
Right.
But I think part of that also, I think, is if you're going to make a documentary, it's kind of thinking about the story and thinking, if I spend a year on this, am I still going to be interested in it? And is there an enduring reason why others will be interested in it then too? Because I get a lot of interesting proposals about documentaries. A lot of them have to do with issues, and the issues are almost always important, but not always, or not nearly as often, are the proposals accompanied by a sense of why telling the story as a documentary would be really interesting, and why a viewer who just is wandering around looking for something to do, would be riveted by that story, because that ends up being, a pretty tough. That ends up being an important challenge to be able to meet.
Has there been a film that you've done over the last 7 years that you thought, I'm hitting this at the perfect time, this is going to be great, and then by the time it came out, you were just kind of wrong, or the subject had died a little bit, or it just didn't have the impact that you thought it would?
Yeah, there was a film I did called Casino Jack in the United States of Money that I just thought was so important. And interestingly enough, it's probably more important now than it was when it came out. But it just missed the election, the Obama election. It was about the lobbyist Jack Abramoff. Yep. And I think because it took place at a time where, for whatever reason, I think it kind of missed its moment. Like I say, I think that moment's coming back. It's all about the corrosive influence of money in politics.
Yeah.
But it just missed it, and I realized, you sure can miss the zeitgeist, and I think that one did. I was disappointed, but I had to admit that that's what happened.
So if it had been a year earlier, you would have hit it, and even if you were releasing it next year, maybe you would have hit it?
Yeah, I think next year, interestingly enough, probably would have been pretty good, or maybe even now, as we're coming in and realizing the corrosive aspect of money in politics, it might have hit it. I think it's timing is important, even though I think you still have to imagine that your film should take place in a kind of a timeless universe. There are some films that need to be done right away because they're so hot, I suppose. But I always try to think, will the film stand the test of time? Is there another reason to do this because the issues or the events happen to be in the headlines?
Yeah, and I think Enron's a good example of a documentary that meant something when it came out, and now if you rewatched it, it means something else, which I guess would be the ultimate goal for these things, right? I
agree. I think it's really important to think about that. I mean, and actually, when I did Enron, everybody looked at me and said, "Oh, you're crazy. We know everything there is to know about Enron," but we didn't, because we hadn't really taken a step back yet. And I got really lucky with that one because, it came out. In fact, I think it was in DVD release just as the trial was ongoing in Houston. But there had been a lot of news about it and a lot of fragmentary stuff, but nobody had really kind of put the pieces together. And then it turned out, when this latest financial crisis happened, you go back and look and see what was happening in 2001, you realize, oh my God, all the signals were there, and we just weren't listening.
Right. What's the best documentary idea you ever had that you couldn't pull off because you couldn't get the person on camera, or something fell through that it couldn't have happened, but you're still bitter about it?
Oh, that's a good question.
Thank you. There's got to be one.
There is one, but I'm not. It's not coming to mind now, and I can't think of why. I'd always wanted to do a film about. Sometimes there are films that just don't interest other people the way they interest me. I'd always wanted to do a film about my stepfather, a guy named William Sloane Coffin Jr. He was the chaplain at Yale, and he had been a big peace activist and an incredibly powerful speaker. And I thought that would be a pretty interesting film, particularly now when religious figures tend to be much more conservative, and he was a wild liberal. But yeah. I could never get anybody interested in that, and I just had to put it aside. So you never know.
What's the documentary from the last 10 years that you're the most jealous of?
Waltz with Bashir.
Really?
I thought that was just fantastic. I thought it was just so good because it took a subject that, on the face of it, the Sabra Shatila massacre.
Yeah.
Who would have? First of all, it was a long time ago. Who cares about it now? And it's very grisly. But it took this idea of soldiers haunted by something and imagined it, in an animation way. You're slowly coming around to this subject and recognizing it like a memory that has been lost, and now you're slowly recovering until the very end of the film. Suddenly, this animated film goes to real life footage, and you realize, okay, right, I've recovered the memory, and now I remember the horror. It was just a really, really powerful film. That was something that just knocked my socks off. That one.
Who's your favorite young, up-and-coming documentarian that you're looking at and going, I got to watch out for that guy?
Well, I got to watch out for that
girl.
guy. There's this guy who did To Hell and Back, really, really awesome. Also, this Danish filmmaker named Janus Metz, who did Armadillo. There are a lot of good ones out there. I always love everything that Heidi and Rachel do, the women who did Jesus Camp. So there are a lot of good ones out there who keep me on my toes.
I think this is going to be, I think we'll see it about 7 years from now. There's going to be a whole bunch of filmmakers who were kind of the children of your generation and from basically 2004 to now, and picking up all the different tricks that you guys use and being inspired by that. And that's going to be the class that pushes the whole documentary thing to just a whole other level. But the last thing I wanted to ask you about, on your IMDb, I never know if these things are true. Untitled Lance Armstrong documentary, post-production. True or untrue?
True.
True.
We're in a holding pattern. The film has been cut, but we're waiting to see how events are going to play out in the next few months. And it's a great, great film. I think it's one of my best.
Oh.
But there's a collective decision made to just kind of wait and see how things play out in the next few months in terms of this investigation into him. But we followed Lance during his 2009 comeback.
Really?
Yeah, and it's a fantastic film. It was commissioned by Sony, and I think it's one of my very, very best, and I hope to show it someday soon. So
I would gather that he must have given you access for this.
He did. He gave us a lot of access, as did some of his harshest critics. So it was great on that score because, and it's not just it's a lot of the talk about Lance has been just about doping. It's not just about that. It is about that. That's part of what it's about, but it's also about the sport and a sense of will. And I think we photographed that sport in a way that nobody has ever photographed it before. It really is a pretty riveting sport. So on all those levels, I think it succeeds pretty well. So I hope it gets out there.
If the facts kind of go against Lance here, and he's somebody that gave you a lot of time, is that a tough battle for you internally? Like, do I want to make this guy? How bad do I want to make this guy look after he's been such a nice guy and given us all this access?
I mean, look, whoever I deal with, I always give them, their opportunity to have their say. So that'll always happen. But at the end of the day, that access thing is a tricky one because you have to be grateful and cognizant of the fact that people give you access. This has to do with Spitzer too. But at the same time, your ultimate obligation is not to the subject, but to the audience. And that's finally, at the end of the day, what you have to keep in mind. And you try to treat people with respect. And if you do that, then I think you can hold your head high, even if you're critical of them, and say, I did my best.
That sounds like what Lester Banks told William Miller in Almost Famous. If you want to be a friend to them, be unmerciful. That's the best way they'll learn about themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like, the idea of being unmerciful. I think mercy does have a place, and
yes,
I think you
agree.
have to always examine whether or not, you're doing something just to enhance your career or just to be a bastard because you think it makes you look good. I think that's a terrible reason to do things. I think you have to feel the pain. If you're going to criticize somebody, you have to feel the pain and be willing to sit in the seat on the other side and ask yourself, is this fair? Is this fair what I'm doing or how I'm presenting this? And I think ultimately that's the test, because a sense of you have to be tough but compassionate, and I think they both go hand in hand.
Well, Alex Gibney, you did a great job with Catching Hell. I'm so glad we're finally getting to show it. I've been getting emails about it for a year because we mentioned it last year. People have been waiting for it. I really hope we get a chance to work with you again. I thought you did a great job, and I'm just a huge fan of your work. So hopefully our paths will cross again down the road.
Well, many thanks, Bill, and let's hope that the Red Sox can find a way to make it into that postseason one more time.
I didn't even want to bring that up during the podcast, but yes, let's hope that. All right, good luck with the documentary.
All right, thanks, Bill. Take care.
So I get to sign off. Whoa!
Thank you for downloading the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Too much fun.
Check out more podcasts at the iTunes Music Store or at PodCenter at ESPNRadio.com.
Peace out.